NTV Television Network presents. The Other Day, Current Era, 1991, translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. You're watching the 31st and final episode of our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, Current Era. Events, people and phenomena that defined a lifestyle. Things that you can't imagine us without, much less comprehend. Today we're covering the year 1991, the war in Iraq, Russian television, humanitarian aid, Viktyuk's plays, the Mercedes S600, Yugoslavia collapses, Yeltsin is president, the coup, Talkov's death, KAMAZ at the Dakar rally, the downfall of the Soviet Union, Pugachev and Yankovsky become USSR people's artists. With commentary from actress Tatiana Drubich, economic expert Egor Gaidar, political expert Sergei Karaganov, author Anatoly Strelyany. For Gorbachev, 1990 was a year of loss and defeat. He was quite obviously intent on making 1991 a year of gain and victory. Gorbachev started to lean right, to put it in Soviet terms. Throughout the winter and most of the spring, he spearheaded the conservative wing within the government. First, they tried to beat the Baltic states into submission, with 2 Sunday massacres occurring in a row, on the 13th and 20th of January, in Vilnius and in Riga. On the 13th of January, SWAT teams stormed the TV studio in downtown Vilnius, as well as the TV tower near a freshly built housing sector. Lithuanian television was doing a live broadcast, and they carried on with that broadcast right up until the moment when a SWAT team raided the studio where the host was sitting. Footage showing the clash next to the TV station's entrance was aired all around the world, even by Central Television, on one of their liberal programs. It was clear that repressive measures weren't going to change anything. The genie was out of the bottle, and even violent blows with a machine gun stock were not going to push it back in. Armored vehicles occupied the entire vast space next to the TV tower. As soon as the locals saw them coming, they rushed to defend the facility. 14 people were killed, 60 were injured. The offensive side lost 1 officer, most likely due to friendly fire with a bullet hitting him in the back while he was climbing through a window. Echo of Moscow was broadcasting non-stop, with one of their journalists reporting on the scene in the Lithuanian capital. The official story said something about nationalists who had a run-in with authorities and wouldn't back down. The following day, reporting at USSR Supreme Soviet proceedings, the Defense and Internal Affairs ministers approved the military's actions overall, but went on to label the events as a local initiative, which wasn't sanctioned by Moscow, as in no such orders were sent to Vilnius. However, the officer who was killed turned out to be a KGB Special Ops lieutenant. There was a dark joke then that went, Moscow responds to Sayudis and the People's Fronts of Latvia and Estonia by sending in the First Baltic Front. This was confirmed 1 week later by what happened in Riga. In Riga, a local SWAT team was attempting to storm the Republican MVD building. The city center was a combat zone. Not only were militia killed, incidentally most of the guards in that building were Russian, but also members of Yuris Podniak's film crew who were recording the firefight. Then finally Gorbachev came out with a statement. On one hand, he condemned separation from the Soviet Union, while on the other insisted that power must only be attained by lawful means, and that the events were not an expression of presidential power. The coup attempts were thwarted. Get back. Back in Moscow, the Kremlin's new course meant suppressing glasnost, that most despised element of democracy. Joint militia and military patrols in the capital appeared to be another demonstration of power. Before that, the only time you'd see a soldier with a machine gun was during a parade. The country's most popular TV program was the first to suffer. On January 4th, Zviad was due to air, but was cancelled. They were supposed to show a film about the retired Shevardnadze's team. Gostelerradio's management said something about updating the show's creative vision, which took a good 8 months. After Tatiana Mitkova from TSN refused to read the official typecast statement on the events in Vilnius, she was pulled from the air together with her co-hosts Dmitry Kiselyov and Yuri Rostov. Radio Russia was forbidden from broadcasting through Mayak and Program 1. Communist Party media wrote "Beware of the haters" on the microphone. Gorbachev had no doubt that Ryzhkov was due for replacement, as demanded by coal miners and Yeltsin. Not to mention his retirement would entail a clean slate for the economy. In December, Ryzhkov happened to suffer a heart attack, rendering him no longer fit for duty. By the old New Year, there was a new prime minister, Valentin Pavlov, the Union's former minister of finance. By the end of his first week in service, he shocked the nation with an emergency exchange campaign of 50 and 100 ruble banknotes. At 9 p.m., they announced that these bills would expire after midnight, that any left in possession had to be turned in. Whether old bills could be traded for new ones, that decision was made by work team commissions if the sum was minor and executive committees if a large amount was at stake. Pavlov claimed that this was to counter foreign conspiracies that might disrupt cash flow in the USSR. Access to saving bank accounts was restricted, with a 500 ruble monthly withdrawal limit. On April 2nd, prices went up. A complex system of upper thresholds and compensations was instated. The situation in stores remained the same. Even with sausage increasing from 2 to 8 rubles in price, you still couldn't find it anywhere. The people resented the chubby chairman with his buzz cut, which was aggravated after he said that the problem was with the people and not with the system. Common folk called him Pavlov's dog. Following Western objects of cult for adults, Europe and America's main kids' idol makes it to the USSR, the Barbie doll, which had been a favorite for 4 generations. The flat-chested domestic talking dolls that called for mama now interested no one beyond babies. All of the grown-up girls wanted Barbie, the first voluptuous doll to come to the USSR. Barbie, with her archetypical beauty and heavenly figure, was a template of dreams for the future, with her own well-furbished house, a complete wardrobe, and a handsome boyfriend named Ken who looked a lot like a young Kobzon. Barbie's perfect body type was like that of a model. If the 11.5-inch doll were grown to 5'9", she'd be 38 inches around the chest, 18 around the waist, and 34 around the hips. Barbie's legs were twice as long as the rest of her body. The happy owners would tailor entire clothing collections for their favorite dolls. Barbie dolls were hard to come by even in Moscow. In July of 1991, Komsomolskaya Pravda published a letter from second grader Ira from Ulkan in Irkutsk province. She really wanted one of those famous dolls to play with. Ira sent a letter requesting the toy to the only influential figure she was aware of, Mikhail Gorbachev. The Soviet Union's president sent the little girl her own letter back, with a bunch of resolutions tacked on. That's when the readers stepped in and sent out a few of those slender plastic dolls. I never knew it could be like this. Thank you. On January 17, 1991, at 3 a.m. Baghdad time, CNN reporters on the 16th floor of the Air Rashad Hotel in the center of the Iraqi capital beat the Department of State to inform the entire world that war has broken out. In a live broadcast, they showed how the city blocks next to the hotel were being bombed. Operation Desert Storm, to free Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, was the first televised war in human history. The world's leading TV stations incorporated live broadcasts into their news segments, while CNN was following the operation virtually round the clock. Saddam Hussein was the modern world's biggest burglar from Baghdad, who occupied Kuwait despite the countries being allies in the recent war with Iran. Kuwait was declared Iraq's 19th province. The UN Safety Council came out with a resolution. Iraq's army had to leave Kuwait by the 15th of January, otherwise a military operation might ensue. The international coalition was mainly constituted of American forces. Starting on January 17th, they waged a war from the skies for over a month by means of brutal airstrikes and Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from ships located in the Persian Gulf. Only after all of Iraq's military infrastructure was decimated did they commence a ground operation that lasted a mere 4 days. On the 28th of February, George Bush announced that Kuwait was liberated. Operation Desert Storm demonstrated how a professional army run by liberals was superior to universal military service under a dictatorship. The American doctrine's remarkable victory was even commended by Red Star, where they published an article titled "This is how the professionals do war." At the International Auto Service 91 exhibition in Moscow, Mercedes-Benz presented its latest model, the full-size S-Class limousine with a 6-liter power plant. The first private orders from the USSR came in within a month. Up until then, any foreign car was a prestigious attribute. But from then on, it was all about the Mercedes S600, or simply the 600. This car was destined to become the troika of post-Soviet Russia. Kommersant newspaper conducted a sociological survey among its readers, defining them as New Russians, which was a term pulled from foreign publications, though it wouldn't remain an elitist designation for the business elite for long. New Russians were featured in a lot of anecdotes of the time, with their typical set of attributes according to folklore, including an S600, a maroon jacket, golden chain, an enormous golden Rolex, fingers held in a horn sign, and a neck that went up all the way to the top of the head.
New Russians were human beings, just like everybody else. Some happy, others discontent, smart, dumb, criminals, workaholics. During Soviet years, there was a lot of contempt building up towards efficiency, rationality, labor. It was all embodied in the phrase, "Aren't you a busy one?" These people were the heroes of the time, with immense villainous charm. They were distinguished by their clothes, Versace suits, maroon jackets, handheld purses, shoes with silver buckles, and of course the largest layer of clothing, their Mercedes-Benzes, their S600s. That was the time of primary accumulation, and their activities were fitting. Robberies, racketeering. They were keepers of a new iteration of the Russian language, used by all generations whether it was appropriate or not. They also upheld new Russian ethics and relationship patterns amidst their brothers and their female partners in crime, along with the contemporary losers that were left to live, the intellectuals and prose writers of the world. Yes, they were anti-heroes, but not without charm. The unoriginal and expensive feats of these New Russians as portrayed in anecdotes, they were a sort of expression of national pride. The Soviet land bears witness to the blatant contrasts of capitalism, with massive unemployment and poverty, and a bourgeois class that could afford anything, including college education. The basic laws on employment passed in 1991 eliminated mandatory labor, prosecution of slackers, and state distribution of college graduates. Now, instead of a job looking for a person, it was the other way around. They began to register those who were unemployed, with the number climbing to 10 million in just 3 months. Only 2 million out of them would receive welfare checks worth 75% of the average salary. Independent estimates placed 1/3 of the country's population on the brink of poverty. People started using the term subsistence minimum, which was set at 210 rubles a month per person. The average salary was about the same at 212 rubles. In reality, the monthly minimum was enough to survive a mere 25 days in the city. A government decree came out that incentivized contractual relationships in universities, who were now allocating up to 1/4 of their spots for applicants willing to pay. Moscow's Commerce Institute set a record price for a college degree, with a 5-year course in international economic affairs costing 40,000 rubles. Today,
The last fruit fly perished. All year round, food was something to worry about daily, with stores being completely empty. People stood in line to buy bread for the first time since the 40s. The West sends humanitarian aid to the Soviet Union. Many saw this as hitting rock bottom. Before that, we only saw food being given away in old Soviet documentaries where we fed the Germans after occupying Berlin, or on fresh film from the West portraying the starving people of Africa. In '91, someone parodied a scene from a movie with a German soldier entering a Russian cabin and offering chicken, eggs, and milk under the guise of humanitarian aid.
Children deserve all the best, something we continue to repeat to this day, but this time while begging.
Mostly the aid consisted of canned food: beef, ham, sausage, compote, juice. Germany sent over millions of army rations. Daycare facilities and kindergartens would give sacks with powdered milk and dry oatmeal to children's parents. In Moscow, where half of the country would always do their shopping, they even tried to ban export of all goods. The militia were searching railroad cars and ambushing trucks on the ring road. The Union republics were no longer transferring their tax revenue to the center. The central government was forced to almost completely rely on the money printing press. The financial system was in a state of severe crisis. There was zero demand for rubles. What's even more crucial is the fact that the socialistic mechanisms for handling the flow of goods were rendered useless. Orders were simply being ignored. Companies were selling their products to whoever they wanted, to whoever had something to offer in exchange. Slips and stamps were in use, though you couldn't get goods for your slips. The center promises to supply resources, but doesn't deliver on those promises. The most dangerous part was that the vacuum in between the defunct planned economy and the inactive market was actively fueling separatism. The main idea was to close the borders and keep all goods within national, republican, provincial, city, and district limits. In Moscow, you couldn't use a stamp to buy anything if you were from out of town, while in Moscow province, they wouldn't sell anything to residents of Moscow. The Soviet government scrambled to find help, seeking either humanitarian aid, something typically reserved for Africa, or to borrow money. Lend us some money. Save us. That was the Soviet government's main message to the West throughout most of 1991.
Saint Seraphim of Sarov foretold that his relics would be lost and then later recovered during difficult times. They were found exactly 70 years after they were seized by commissars and subsequently disappeared. In 1991, when the country found itself in a dire situation, the relics were found in the Kazan Cathedral in Leningrad, which at the time was a museum of the history of religion and atheism. Seraphim of Sarov was the second most revered saint of the Russian Orthodox Church after Sergius of Radonezh. A special board confirmed that the relics were genuine. First, they were transported to Moscow from Leningrad and then to Seraphim's homestead in Nizhny Novgorod province. Taking Seraphim's relics back to their former place of repose in the Sarov monastery was out of the question, with Sarov having long become the closed town of Arzamas 16. One church was converted to a store, the other to a theater. Ultimately, the relics were placed in the Seraphim Diveyevo monastery, founded by Seraphim of Sarov himself. A procession took place in the very heart of Russia. That went on for 10 days and was greeted by hundreds of thousands of people. The Diveyevo district administration confidently claimed that the arrival of Seraphim's relics will aid in the development of the non-Chernozem lands. Journalists referred to the imperishable relics as the saint's ashes. The moment they were being carried into the cathedral, pilgrims claimed to see a double rainbow. Jawaharlal Nehru's descendants were subject to an ill fate. First, one of his daughter Indira Gandhi's two sons died in a plane crash, and then she herself was killed by Sikh terrorists. In May of 1991, Indira's second son Rajiv Gandhi was murdered.
The ex-Prime Minister and leader of the Indian National Congress Party, together with Rajiv Gandhi, were on a pre-election tour around the country. In a town near Madras, a woman from the crowd handed him a flower basket. When she went for the traditional Indian bow, a massive explosion occurred that killed 15 people, including Gandhi and the suicide bomber assassin. The explosives were tied to the woman's waist. Investigators learned that the bombing was carried out by members of a separatist movement called Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, based in Sri Lanka. Members of the Gandhi family were always regarded as friends of the Soviet Union. The official condolences extended by national leadership were followed by Mikhail Gorbachev and his wife sending a personal telegram to Sonia, Rajiv's wife. It read, "We are shocked to hear the terrible news about the malicious murder." To prove that the country's peoples were against dividing a great superpower into separate republics, Gorbachev announces that on March 17, 1991, there would be a referendum on preserving the USSR. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldavia immediately refused to participate, and so the vote took place in 9 of the republics. Russian leadership decided to simultaneously conduct a referendum on instating the position of Russian president, while calling to say no in response to Gorbachev. Yeltsin claimed that the referendum served to maintain the current consolidated union. The people voted to establish the position of president, while 76% were in favor of preserving the union and a bit less than 22% were against it. The ballot question that went, "Do you consider it necessary to maintain the USSR as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics where the rights and freedoms of a person of any ethnicity will be fully guaranteed?" was like in the movie The Foundling. "Little girl, do you want to go to the village or would you like your head torn off?" If instead they'd have asked, "Would you like to live A in the Soviet Union or B in your own republic converted to a sovereign nation?" the results would have been much different. We now know that the results were completely removed from real-life events. The bourgeois Commerçant publishes an article titled "The referendum is over, we'll leave it at the plebiscite." Central Committee member, Foreign Affairs Minister Raoul Leroy and other officials. Theater attendance saw a drastic decline. Old plays weren't cutting it, new ones weren't coming out. With the scene completely stagnant and Soviet theater lacking any sort of shock value since the late 20s, the play M. Butterfly, directed by Roman Viktyuk, was something sensational. That controversial play made Viktyuk, who had never been popular before, into a notorious celebrity. The play, written by David Huang, was about a French diplomat who fell in love with an actress from the Beijing Opera, not knowing that they only employed men. It's unlikely that this was just an accidental mistake. The cheated Gallimar was a breakthrough role for Sergei Makovetsky. The devilishly stylish countertenor Eric Kurmangaliev brought something new to the Russian scene by portraying a male vamp. First to theater buffs and then to newspaper readers everywhere, Viktyuk became a singer of homosexual passion. Critics made snarky comments about his aesthetic on that account. Not long before, the post-war map of Europe appeared to be rock solid. However, only Germany united, with a series of dissolutions following soon after. In the first half of '91, Yugoslavia was the first to collapse. In that form, the country had come about in 1918 and consisted of lands that for centuries before were part of the Ottoman or Austro-Hungarian Empire. The ragtag conglomerate was never a peaceful place. But after the war, the Yugoslavian Federation had always been held together by the dictator Marshal Josip Broz Tito. Once he was gone, there was nobody left who could handle the ethnic tension. Upon gaining independence, the former Yugoslavian republics almost immediately start fighting with each other, threatening to once again turn the Balkans into an extremely volatile region of Europe. Slovenia and Macedonia were the only ones to separate without any commotion. In Croatia, the Serbs created an autonomous province called Krajina and were looking to reunite with Serbia. The first ethnic clashes occurred in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the Serbian community was also seeking union with Serbia. The prosperous socialist country that Soviet tourists dreamed about traveling to was now a European Lebanon with multiple factions engaging in combat. Everybody who was watching found the animosity between the Serbs and the Croats to be absurd, with them appearing to be one people with a common language, separated only by their religion and alphabet. Regardless, the West was rooting for the Catholic Croats, Russia for the Orthodox Serbs. On May 13, 1991, for the first time ever, Channel 2 airs Russian television programming. The company's executives Roman Poptsov and Anatoly Lysenko claim that Russian TV, as opposed to Central Television, is devoid of censorship. They set up 4 studios: Vesti for news, Respublika journalism, Lad fiction literature, Artel entertainment and music. Vesti was the news station's flagship program and main powerhouse. News from Russian television filled the void left after TSN was disbanded. The feud between Union and Russian news was intensifying, with the all-Union TV radio company and RTR becoming political rivals. The vast majority of the people were aligned with Yeltsin's government, and the progressive mass audience preferred to watch Russian television. For many years, Soviet people had no idea that we never signed a peace treaty with Japan and never were really worried about the expropriated South Sakhalin and Kuril Islands. The brief war with Japan in 1945 was never considered a separate event. It was more of an extension of World War II. The aftermath of the Kwangtung Army's defeat didn't seem to raise any contention, but then we learned of the Japanese Northern Territory issue, with our side engaging in a heated debate, leading up to our own national leader's first ever visit to Japan. Before, the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs wouldn't even admit to there being a territorial dispute, but now they were carefully alluding to territorial demarcation. The Japanese had high hopes for their negotiations with Gorbachev. Soviet patriots were up in arms, with there allegedly being a plan to sell 4 of the southern Kuril Islands, Iturub, Kunashir, Habamai, and Shikotan, or alternatively to exchange the latter 2 for a peace treaty, something carelessly suggested by Khrushchev a while back. In reality, Gorbachev was simply open to discussion, and though they held 6 rounds of negotiation instead of the planned 3, that trip ended right where it began. At the press conference, Gorbachev said, "Let's not get ahead of ourselves with predictions, and instead get to work." Other government officials. However, the leaders of 2 superpowers agreed on the need for more active dialogue, The socialist bloc actually fell apart back in 1989, which is when Eastern and Central European countries abandoned socialism. It was only formalized, though, in 1991 when they dissolved the military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, and the economic union that was the CoMEcon. Leaving satellite nations to their own devices, Soviet leadership took care of just one high-profile collaborationist and granted asylum to the former head of the former East Germany, Erich Honecker. Emergency conferences were held in Budapest, then in Prague, and in Budapest again. Military bodies were promptly dismantled, all military agreements and friendship treaties were voided. CoMEcon properties, the book building on Kalinin Prospect and the Druzhba Hotel, were sold to Moscow's city administration for peanuts. The last first secretaries all had it rough, but Honecker was being harbored by a Soviet military hospital, and when a Berlin court ordered his arrest, he was immediately transported to Moscow. The Germans were outraged. Gorbachev asked they have mercy on the old man and promised that we wouldn't keep him for long, since Honecker was looking to visit his daughter in Chile. Honecker himself claimed that he would only return to Germany in a casket. CoMEcon and the Warsaw Pact being terminated was the inevitable consequence of all of those velvet and not-so-velvet revolutions of 1989, when the communists lost their power in Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, also in Hungary and Romania. However, the separation was formalized in a very haphazard manner. It was our own actions that led to trade for convertible currency emerging within the CoMEcon. We were to blame for internal commerce falling apart. Well, and after that, the CoMEcon's fate was sealed. As for the disbanding of the Warsaw Pact, we were unable to make it so that the treaties that came after would forbid former Warsaw Pact member states from joining other military alliances. Kwiecinski, who at the time was Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister and was overseeing the negotiations, well, he actually insisted on adding such a clause to the agreement with Romania, though that was all he could manage, with him being berated by democratic Soviet media. So instead of creating a belt of neutral, non-militarized nations, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact led to the expansion of NATO.
Given that 70% of the Russian people agreed on establishing the position of Russian president at the referendum, on June 12th, exactly 1 year after the USSR declared its sovereignty, with the day already having been declared a holiday, a Republican presidential election was held. Boris Yeltsin won in a landslide in the very first round, receiving 57.3% of all votes. Each presidential candidate was supposed to run with their vice presidential candidate. There were three main duos. The USSR Prime Minister Ryzhkov, who was backed by the Communist Party, with Afghan war hero General Gromov. They came in second. Zhirinovsky, who was leader of the Democratic Liberal Party, took to the all-Russian stand for the first time and immediately made a name for himself with his aptitude for criticism and promises of good fortune. Together with the red entrepreneur Zviad, they were third on the list. Or a new economy. Yeltsin unexpectedly paired with the leader of a faction that broke away from the Communist Party, hero of the Soviet Union, Colonel Alexander Rutskoy. Apparently, Yeltsin's reasoning was that his vice president would counterbalance the hatred that communists and the military had for him. To accommodate the inauguration, the People's Deputy Conference was moved to the Palace of Congresses.
We have collectively chosen the path of peaceful, lawful, democratic transformation.
The country witnessed on live TV the Patriarch giving Yeltsin his blessing, and Gorbachev begrudgingly congratulating him.
We all just bore witness to an act of ceremony.
Of course, there were talks about this being the first time Russia had ever straight-up elected its own national leader, but plenty of people saw this as part of Soviet history and Soviet logic, as if Yeltsin took a bit of power away from Gorbachev, which was seen as him standing up to the central government. Him beating out Ryzhkov in the election was, quote, challenging the Communist Party's unchecked power. On top of that, Gorbachev had been elected president, albeit just by this auditorium. Gamsakhurdia had been chosen in Georgia by popular vote. People were getting used to the word president. You need to hear it as if through a stranger's ears to realize how weird it sounds. The president of Russia. How is that even real? It sounds as bizarre as if someone were to say Tsar of the United States. In 1991, Soviet KAMAZ trucks once again take part in the world's most challenging and illustrious rally, the Dakar. Their first attempt was a failure, with all three trucks breaking down long before the race was over. This time, we brought 5 trucks to the starting line in Paris. Each of these KAMAZs was hand-built, every component was double-checked. The Russian automotive industry, which not many people took seriously, was able to produce trucks to rival Mercedes-Benzes and Volvos. The KAMAZs came in 2nd, 3rd, 6th, 11th, and 12th in the truck class overall, but among triple-axle rigs, they made it to 1st and 2nd, with the locals looking on in amazement. Starring Tom Hanks.
I got it. Hey. I believe he said he had to go pee.
On August 19, 1991, at 6 a.m., Central Television hosts made a grim announcement, repeating a statement from the Supreme Soviet Chairman Lukyanov, who claimed that the pending union agreement was totally unacceptable. The USSR's vice president issued a decree. As Mikhail Gorbachev is unfit to continue performing his duties as president of the Soviet Union, effective on August 19, 1991, Yanayev will assume the position of acting president. Soviet leadership declares a national emergency and puts together a state committee on the state of emergency, the USSR SCSE. The appeal goes on to say that the reforms have reached a dead end. The SCSE's first decree suspended any sort of political party activity, while promising to prevent from increasing and even cut prices, and to even give away land plots of up to 1,800 square yards. Files of armored vehicles were en route to Moscow, with the Tamanskaya, Kantemirovskaya, and Dzerzhinsky divisions entering the capital city. At 9 a.m., Yeltsin addresses the Russian people, together with Prime Minister Silayev and acting RSFSR Supreme Soviet Chairman Khasbulatov. They label these actions a revolutionary revolt and call for a general strike. In the capital, the message was transmitted by Echo of Moscow, but it couldn't be relayed to the rest of the country, with television shut down and Channel 1 broadcasting orders from the SCSE, music concerts, and the Swan Lake. A couple of thousand people gathered next to the Russian residency, the White House on Krasnopresnenskaya Riverside Drive. 10 T-72 tanks had been parked there since morning, with their crews having pledged allegiance to Yeltsin. In the aftermath of that turmoil, the former RSFSR House of Unions was surrounded by a massive fence. Right here at noon, Yeltsin climbed onto a tank, projecting a picture-perfect image of a surrounded bastion's commander who came to meet with his people. Excuse me for my professional cynicism, but with the coup already making exceptional news material, Yeltsin on a tank would become an even more vivid representation of communism's downfall than German people on top of the Berlin Wall. The world was looking on pretty much in real time, while the Soviet Union had to wait until 10 p.m. Moscow time to watch a report by Sergei Medvedev on Vremya. Now, since this video document did make it into the news, with it bearing tremendous mobilization potential, speaking in old terms, that meant that the SCSE wasn't fully in control of the situation. We declare it unlawful. While on the tank, Yeltsin reads a decree on voiding the SCSE's orders on Russian territory. Before the report came out on Vremya, the SCSE held a live press conference at the Foreign Affairs Ministry building. Most high-profile members were absent. Prime Minister Pavlov, Defense Minister Yazov, KGB Chairman Kryuchkov. Yanayev's hands were shaking.
Given the circumstances, we have no other choice but to take decisive action in order to prevent the country from spiraling towards disaster.
Tatiana Malkina from the Independent newspaper offers him to choose a historical analogy between 1917 and 1964. At the end of day one, it was clear that the coup had failed. The next day, 200,000 people gathered next to the White House, with there being a siege planned for the evening. Curfew was instated in Moscow. Alpha Team ignored its orders to initiate the siege. A run-in with tanks in the tunnel on the Garden Ring resulted in the deaths of 3 protectors of the White House, last names Komar, Krychevsky, Usov. On the 21st, the SCSE quickly spirals into oblivion. The coup instigators flew to the Crimea, where Gorbachev was in isolation this entire time at his Foros residency. They were soon followed by Rudskoy and Silayev. On the 22nd, they started arresting SCSE members, and during celebrations at the White House, they decided to reinstate the old tricolor Russian flag. Gorbachev held a press conference when he came back, where he announced that some things he wasn't at liberty to disclose, while still calling out who is who. At midnight, they dismantled Dzerzhinsky's statue next to KGB headquarters in order to appease the protesters. The following day, Gorbachev met with RSFSR Supreme Soviet deputies. From here on out, Soviet leadership would continually be steamrolled by the Russian government.
Now that we are face to face, he has handed me a short summary of the Cabinet of Ministers proceedings, which I have yet to read. Read it out loud.
On the 24th, the fallen were buried. They would be referred to as the last victims of the Soviet regime. Yeltsin apologizes to their parents. The rest of the country took impassively to the events in Moscow. The SCSE was destined to be disliked. Nobody believed Gorbachev was ill, but no mass protests occurred anywhere else in the country. All it took to end Bolshevism was a few dozens of thousands of Muscovites. Local, regional, and district committees were shut down on orders from the center.
Well done.
On September 6, 1991, Leningrad was renamed back to St. Petersburg. Zagorsk in Moscow province, where the Holy Trinity Sergius Lavra was located, became Sergiev Posad once again as requested by the Patriarch. In Moscow and St. P, as well as in many regional capitals, they restore pre-Soviet city street names. An observation by author Alexander Rybakov. Everyone who used to call Gorky Street Tverskaya has died as of recently. Now it's up to us who called it Gorky Street to die out for it to actually become Tverskaya. Solzhenitsyn, who was living in Vermont, suggested giving Leningrad a new name entirely, such as Nevograd. Many were expecting them to use Petrograd, with St. Petersburg seeming a bit clunky. But that's how it went, from socialism straight to feudalism, while skipping capitalism. Kirovsky Bridge was renamed back to Troitsky, Kirovsky Prospect to Kamenno-Ostrovsky. Mossovet made Sverdlov Square into Theater Square, Marx Prospect became Okhotny Ryad and Makhovaya streets, Mayakovsky Square was now Triumphalnaya. The renaming carried on for 3 more years. The U.S. ambassador's team receives information from agents of the former KGB on how the new U.S. embassy building in Moscow was bugged. They called this a gesture of goodwill. Ambassador Robert Strauss personally delivered these documents to Washington, D.C. the very next day, and soon the entire world became aware of something that had never happened in the history of espionage. Between 1976 and 1982, during construction, they literally stuffed the walls with the most state-of-the-art equipment they had. Some of those bugs they actually found and decided not to move into their new facility. Instead, they spent $300 million to build a new one. The USSR vehemently denied installing any such devices, but the Americans still retaliated by suspending construction of the new Soviet embassy building in D.C. Immediately after the schematic was delivered, a group of agents commenced an internal investigation on what their new boss Bakatin was up to, accusing him of high treason. In turn, Bakatin claimed that the government was responsible, not his agency, that Gorbachev, Yeltsin, ministers Pankin and Kozyrev gave their approval. The Americans were supposed to do the same, given that most likely they were also up to something. But official DC refused to make any comments on the matter.
Relay information on where the bugs were planted to the US government, which they already knew.
On October 6, 1991, behind the scenes at a concert in St. Petersburg's Yubileyny sports complex, singer, poet, and composer Igor Talkov was shot at point-blank range. The details were truly shocking. Talkov, who was performing a song called Russia, was killed over whether he comes out before or after Aziza sings her song. Aziza's bodyguard Malakhov came into Talkov's dressing room and demanded that he walk out before Aziza. Apparently in showbiz there's more honor the later you get on stage. The argument turned into a fight. Talkov drew a gas pistol, Malakhov a real gun, and one of the 3 bullets he fired hit Talkov right in the heart. Stop the music. Please stay silent for a minute. All militia who are... Turn off the music. All militia in the building, secure the sports arena immediately. Igor Talkov has just been shot. Igor Talkov has just been shot behind the scenes. Malakhov was able to flee. He was the killer without a doubt in anybody's mind. 10 days later, Malakhov turned himself in and was unexpectedly released, though placed under travel restrictions. It turned out that Talkov was shot, probably by accident, by his manager Shliafman, who during the fight snatched the pistol with one bullet left from Malakhov. By that time, Shliafman had already flown to Israel, where he was beyond the reach of Russian authorities. Open the doors! He's not breathing! Prior to 1991, ethnic conflicts were occurring only outside of Russia. In his struggle against the Soviet government, Yeltsin offered the autonomies to take as much sovereignty as they could carry. However, in 1991, the United Congress of the Chechen People announced that the republic was neither under Soviet nor Russian control. On September 3rd, the Congress's leader, retired Major General Egor Dudaev, declares the deposition of the Republican Supreme Soviet run by Doku Zavgayev for association with the SCSE. On September 15th, a temporary High Council was formed with Dudaev at the helm, and it took charge of the republic. Chechnya's population was divided into those who supported either the Supreme Soviet or Dudaev. 2 meetings at once took place in Grozny. Central authorities recognized the temporary High Council as the only legitimate government entity in the republic. A delegation was sent to Grozny from Moscow consisting of Khasbulatov, Burbulis and Poltoranin, but the negotiations failed, as Dudaev was looking to run a sovereign Chechnya. In late October he became president, and simultaneously a new parliament was put together. According to Moscow, only 10 to 12% of the population came to vote, prompting the RSFSR People's Deputy Congress to nullify the election. Rutskoy was sent to talk some sense into Dudaev. Upon returning, he begins preparing a decree on declaring a state of emergency in the republic. The Chechen people banded together in the face of the central government potentially interfering, and Dudaev was now considered a hero. A confederation of mountain peoples was established in Sukhumi to back him up and to confront Russia. On top of that, RSFSR leadership had no way to back their decree, with the army answering to Gorbachev. The state of emergency was cancelled before it was even instated. I'm glad that Russia's current leaders, in their agony and final convulsions, are releasing this awful stench. They're just helpless. In response to people complaining that they're terrified to walk the streets, the militia decided that it's time to legalize self-defense weapons. The MVD had already prepared a law on monitoring weapons. But before anybody even made it legal, self-defense sprays started to grow in popularity, with women in particular putting their faith into them. Bird cherry became a viable year-round gift idea for women. Tear and nerve gases were mostly brought in from Poland, hidden deep in someone's personal luggage. If you're able to successfully spray your assailant, that'll immediately incapacitate him for 5 to 10 minutes. Everybody who had a can was itching to try it out, and real-life use proved that the spray doesn't work on dogs or drunks. Women barely ever got a chance to use their spray, with it usually still being inside the purse that got snatched by a robber. Using the gas back then could have been qualified as inflicting mild or severe harm, depending on its toxicity. You could even get in trouble just for carrying it around with you. The events of August appropriately culminated in a decree issued by Yeltsin right before the October holidays. The Soviet and RSFSR communist parties were to be shut down, their organizational networks dissolved. The party's property was now under state control. Town and regional committee buildings were reserved for use by government agencies. Also, a search began for the party gold, under the assumption that an enormous amount of money was being kept in secret accounts somewhere in the West. Apparently, they wanted to bring the Communist Party to trial, similar to how the National Socialists were persecuted in Germany, all in the name of declaring it a criminal organization. The pioneer song lyrics "Gaidar is marching up ahead" gained new meaning in late autumn of 1991. The famous Kids author's grandson effectively becomes head of the government and launches radical economic reforms. Arkady Gaidar was a regiment commander when he was 16, while Yegor at 35 managed an entire country. In early autumn, Gaidar took up RSFSR Secretary of State Burbulis's offer to gather a committee for preparing propositions pertaining to Russia's economic policy. The group included Avin, Vavilov, Glaziev, Golovkov, Danilov, Danilyanko, Golovsky, Mashits, Nechayev, Saltykov, Chubais, and Chokhin. Given a budget deficit of 30% GNP, hyperinflation, catastrophic lack of produce, squandered gold reserve, and an average salary in Moscow of $7 a month, Gaidar suggested lifting fixed prices and preparing for privatization, for imposing a market economy. Starting on New Year, Yeltsin decided to greenlight the shock economic reforms. On November 5th, he himself took control of the cabinet and, together with Burbulis, tended to the political side of things, while Gaidar, as Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Economy and Finances, began implementing economic measures. Members of Gaidar's team were appointed as ministers and granted high ranks in the government. Before the new year, newspapers wrote that the future has in store new prices and forgotten goods. On December 1st, 1991, the Ukrainian people elected Leonid Kravchuk as their president. At the same time, 90% of the population voted in favor of establishing a sovereign republic. An appeal to the parliaments and peoples of the world was put together on voiding the 1922 treaty on the creation of the USSR. On December 7th, Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich, the head of Belarus, met in secret at Belovezhskaya Pushcha. Yeltsin presents Gorbachev's new Union Treaty draft to his colleagues, claiming that he would sign only after his Ukrainian counterpart. Kravchuk predictably refused to sign. The leaders of the three republics that initially put together the 1922 treaty were gathered to dismantle the USSR. It was in Belarus where the events took place that led to the downfall of the Russian Empire. In 1917, Nicholas II left his field office in Mogilev, Belarus, and along the way renounced the throne. 1 year later, in Brest, the Bolsheviks signed a peace treaty according to which Russia, with Ukraine already having split away, had to relinquish Poland, the Baltic lands, partially Belarus, and the South Caucasus. Fast forward another 73 years, we're at the Vyskuly residence in Belarus. Here Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich struck an agreement, one that spelled the end for the world's last existing empire, which very shortly after ceased to exist. Preparations for the meeting were made in haste. It turned out that there were no copying machines at the residence, so copies of the document were made using a fax machine. On December 8th, Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich sign a statement by national leaders on establishing a Commonwealth of Independent States. Work on the new Union Treaty had reached a dead end. Sovereign nations emerging on Soviet territory was now very much a reality, and they were just there to formalize what had already transpired. On December 11th, Kazakhstan and Armenia jumped on board. On December 21st, in Alma-Ata, the heads of 11 former Soviet republics signed the declaration. Every one except Georgia and the Baltic states. Millions of people from west to east, from the northern to the southern reaches had trouble wrapping their heads around the events, though they immediately began joking that 3 dudes went to the forest and canceled the Soviet Union while they were in there. First off, people thought it would carry on even canceled, and carry on it did. Second of all, the country was on the brink of disaster and starvation. Survival was a much higher priority for common folk than wax poetry. From these parts, it was either Yeltsin who was the first to call George Bush or Shushkevich to telephone Gorbachev. Regardless, these two customers had a clearer understanding of what had happened than anybody else. The Soviet Union was no more, and the United States were the only superpower left standing.
So the Soviet Union collapsed, or rather was unable to bounce back from Soviet people not paying attention to the events in Belovezha. They didn't take any of it seriously, with their lives remaining much the same for some time after. They were still using old currency and passports, and you could still freely travel to any part of the former Union. Also, bear in mind that the CIS united us, the three main Slavic nations: Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Everyone else was free to do whatever. We decided not to wait for them to separate, but instead beat them to it. Like later on, you'll be asking us to take you back, and we'll decide who we accept and who we don't. It was this attitude that made the Soviet Union's collapse inevitable. Back in '88, I wrote an article for the literature newspaper, claiming that the main problem won't be the Soviet Union dissolving, but the people frantically trying to piece it back together. There was potential. What kept that from happening was Soviet recklessness and imperialist arrogance. Keeping the same money and passports was reckless, though it did help soften the transition to the new age. As for the imperialist arrogance component, well, that blinded Russian people to what was coming, to the fact that nobody was coming back. In December of 1991, Zviad Gamsakhurdia's time as Georgian leader was coming to an end. A New Year's battle was on at Rustaveli Prospect. The president was locked in the House of Government's bunker, where he was unsuccessfully calling for the people to come to his rescue. This site has been annexed and occupied by troops. Pretty much all of Georgia's political actors had turned on Gamsakhurdia. Even his closest associates had joined the opposition, including Prime Minister Sigua. On December 21st, a coup begins. But the only battles happening were next to the House of Government, which harbored the few people left who still supported Zviad. The subway and stores in Tbilisi were open, and the people standing in gigantic lines weren't bothered by the power struggle happening downtown. This went on until the offensive side forced Gamsakhurdia and his people to exit the bunker. From there they made it to Armenia and then to Chechnya. The first president of Georgia was now in exile. Yeltsin's move from the White House into the Kremlin was a clear and simple illustration of the changeovers occurring in 1991. The Ukrainian and Belarusian USSR became simply Ukraine and Belarus. Every other country simply dropped the adage Soviet Socialist Republic, while Russia simultaneously replaced the RSFSR and the USSR. In late December, Yeltsin abolished the Union Foreign Affairs Ministry, MVD, Gosbank, and Prosecutor's Office, replacing them with their Russian counterparts. The RSFSR was renamed to Russia, the Russian Federation. On December 24th, it took the Soviet Union's place in the UN. And on December 25th, Gorbachev made his last statement, stepping down as president of the USSR. Independent nations, I will no longer be acting as president of the USSR. Gorbachev signed an order on his resignation as commander-in-chief, with the nuclear briefcase being passed on to Yeltsin. The day before, Gorbachev bid farewell to the government staff and had a long conversation with Yeltsin on how he would continue to exist as the retired head of state. At 7:38 p.m., the Soviet flag raised above the Kremlin was replaced by the Russian tricolor. The former Union republics were moving away from the Union center, but Russia had nowhere to retreat, with its only option being displacing the center. The Baltic states regained their sovereignty, while the others basically had to start from scratch. Even without due formal procedures, Russia was seen as the Soviet Union's successor, the country that would carry on its legacy. As for the Soviet era, despite talks about a common past, it was also regarded as part of Russian history. As in, there used to be a country run from Moscow's Kremlin, there is and will be a country with Moscow's Kremlin as the center.
In December, the Soviet Union paid off one of its debts. Insignificant as it may have been, it wasn't inconsequential. The country had a change in its foreign policy priorities, with Zionists ceasing to be the worst people on earth, and the patriots going on about the Russophobic Jews losing their influence. We had restored diplomatic relations with Israel. The credential letters handed out by Ambassador Alexander Bovin were still of Soviet standard. Since 1988, there had been an Israeli consular section operating within the Netherlands embassy. The former Israeli embassy located on Ordinka Street still wasn't being used, despite the Politburo discussing the matter twice. The decision to fully restore diplomatic ties with Israel was made in October of 1991. Izvestia political commentator Alexander Bovin, who was a prominent liberal journalist, was appointed as the ambassador in Israel. During Soviet times, he was the only man to plainly state that Israel's interests had to be considered when resolving the situation in the Middle East. One of Gorbachev's final orders was granting the status of USSR people's artists to a couple of late Soviet-era superstars. Pop diva Alla Pugacheva became the last female, womanizing theater and cinema star Oleg Yankovsky the last male people's artist of the USSR. I know what your problem is. You take things too seriously. Trying to look smart doesn't make you smart, my friends. Yankovsky was the hero in an unheroic time. In the 19th century or in times untold, he went to battle, broke hearts, climbed the gallows. While in the 1970s and 80s, his own heart was the last one he hadn't yet broken. It's hopeless. Absolutely no desire to go in for a kiss. Oh, and those heavy, unladylike footsteps. What's there to even appreciate? Not a single interesting feature, nothing. Oh, why does Mother Nature have to deprive the smart ones like that? Pugacheva, the main voice of her era, made it into the next one in that same status. The single unbridled passion of Soviet-Russian song. And that concludes our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, Current Era. In these 31 episodes, we did our very best to represent us, and perhaps even to understand. Consider these early memoirs on events that affected all of us who transitioned from the Soviet Union to Russia. That does it for history. From here on out, we'll be showcasing a recollection of modern times. Farewell.